Vorlag was a jewel of a world, a polished obsidian sphere hanging in the cold void of the Segmentum Pacificus. It was known by many names across the subsector: the Gilded World, the Adamant Throne, the Forge of Heroes. Its tribute to the Imperium was not in regiments of guardsmen or tons of ore, but in something far more potent: valor. Vorlag was a night world, its surface dominated by the towering citadels of its noble houses, each one home to a dynasty of pilots who had bonded with their throne Mechanicum for generations uncounted. Their tithe was the tithe of valor, a decennial offering of a dozen of their finest knights, not merely the machines, but the princes and scions bound to them, sent to serve in the Emperor's endless wars. This offering was preceded by a planet-wide festival of ritual combat, a glorious spectacle where knights dueled upon plains of black glass under the watchful eyes of their High King Malachi Vane. It was said the psychic resonance of these duels, the sheer focused might of honor and duty, was a beacon of imperial strength that shone brightly even on distant Terra. But in the shadowed cloisters of the Scholastica Sicana and the silent data vaults of the Ordo Hereticus, other more disturbing whispers circulated. For decades, the astropathic choirs of the surrounding systems had noted a dissonance, a faint but persistent psychic static that emanated from the Vorlag system. It was like a single high-pitched scream hidden beneath the roar of a triumphant orchestra. Messages from Vorlag were always clear, their content filled with bombastic declarations of loyalty and honor, yet the very medium that carried them seemed stained with a spectral agony. Inquisitors who reviewed the world's history noted the strange customs that had evolved. Their rituals of succession were invariably settled by duels to the death. Their sacristans were cloistered and secretive, their rites of maintenance for the knights as much bloody sacrifice as they were mechanical liturgy. The art of the world was magnificent, but unsettling. Scrimshawed bone from colossal beasts decorated every archway, and tapestries woven with metallic thread depicted not just glorious victories, but the excruciating final moments of their vanquished foes in obsessive, loving detail. This growing disquiet finally coalesced into action in the form of Inquisitor Kalen Vor. He was not a man of fire and brimstone like so many of his ordo. Vor was a scholar of decay, a quiet, patient dissector of civilizations. He understood that the most profound heresies were not screamed in anarchic rage, but whispered in the gilded halls of power, nurtured over centuries until they became tradition. He arrived on Vorlag not in a black and gold inquisitorial cruiser, but aboard a humble administratum freighter, his retinue disguised as tithe auditors and Mechanicus observers. His presence was a small, gray stone dropped into a vibrant, colorful sea. High King Malachi Vane received him with all the performative grandeur Vor had expected. The king was a giant of a man, his face a mask of stern nobility framed by a mane of silver hair. He stood 2 heads taller than a normal man, a benefit of the subtle genetic tinkering his line had practiced for millennia. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, and when he spoke of honor, his voice boomed through the throne room, a cavernous space whose ceiling was the upturned ribcage of some forgotten megafauna. "Inquisitor," Vane proclaimed, his voice echoing from the polished bone walls, "you find Vorlag in a state of readiness, as always. Our finest are preparing for the coming festival. The tithe of valor shall be our strongest yet. The Emperor's enemies will tremble before the might forged on our world." Vor offered a thin, dry smile. Your loyalty is a matter of legend, High King. I am merely here to observe. The Administratum has concerns about the efficiency of your world's contributions. They seek to learn from your devotion. For weeks, Vor and his acolytes moved through the society of Vorlag like ghosts. They watched the knights train, their movements impossibly fluid, their machine spirits unnervingly silent and aggressive. They observed the sacristans at their work, their faces hidden behind polished chrome masks as they anointed the adamantium limbs of the war machines with strange, steaming unguents enchanted in a dialect of lingua technis that was laced with sibilant, unfamiliar phrases. The air in the forges was thick not just with the scent of ozone and sacred oils, but with the coppery tang of blood. Vor noted that the servitors used for heavy labor were not the usual lobotomized criminals. They were captured Xenos and off-world rebels, kept in a state of perpetual screaming agony, their torments supposedly tempering the resolve of the knights who witnessed it daily. The nobles themselves were the most unsettling part of the equation. They were flawless physical specimens, beautiful and strong, but their eyes held a chilling emptiness, a predatory hunger that was only briefly sated in the heat of their ritual duels. They spoke of duty, of the emperor, of the machine god, but their true worship was reserved for the throne Mechanicum itself. To them, the bonding was the ultimate state of existence, a transcendence that their entire lives were geared towards. Those who failed to bond, who were found wanting by the throne, were not merely cast out. They vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came deep within the citadel of the High King, in the most sacred of the sacristan forges. Under the pretext of reviewing the esoteric power conduits of Vane's own knight, a magnificent machine named the Obsidian Heart, Vor used his authority to gain access to the sanctum's core. Behind panels of sanctified gold and walls of blessed adamantium, his auspexes screamed warnings of biosignatures and energy patterns that were profoundly heretical. Bypassing the outer shell, he found it, a pulsing network of silvery, vein-like cables interwoven with the holy circuitry of the Omnissiah. They were not made of metal, but of a living, shifting substance that seemed to writhe with a malevolent intelligence. At the heart of the junction, where the primary conduits from the throne Mechanicum should have connected to the knight's plasma reactor, was a glistening organ, a biomechanical heart of alien design. It was a grotesque fusion of Drakari fleshcraft and imperial technology, and as Vor watched, it contracted with a wet, visceral pulse. With that pulse, a wave of pure, undiluted agony washed over him, a psychic echo so potent that his mind reeled. It was the scream, the hidden static he had been hunting, now amplified 1,000-fold. This was no mere heresy. This was an infestation, a corruption so deep and so old that it wore the skin of the world itself. The void where the obsidian gates hung was a place of profound emptiness. It was a dead system, its star a bloated, dying ember that cast a sanguine, blood-red light over the sector. Here, at the nexus of several major webway arteries, the Drakari had built their primary real space bastions. They were not mere portals. They were fortresses of such scale and malice that they dwarfed the mightiest imperial star forts. Imagine mountains of fused black glass and psychically resonant iron, carved with screaming faces and barbed archways that gaped like the maws of leviathans. Each gate fortress was a sovereign territory, bristling with forests of dark-light lances and launch bays that could vomit forth entire pirate fleets. Surrounding them was a minefield of chained asteroids, captured ships left to rot, and stasis caskets containing shrieking captives, all woven together by shimmering fields of pure agony designed to shred the sanity of any who drew near. This was the target, not Kamara itself, not yet, but the locks on its front door. The dawnlight-conquered fleet emerged from the webway, not with a whisper, but a roar. The fabric of reality groaned and tore as hundreds of ships punched through into the bloody twilight. The graceful, bone-white hulls of the Assyriani vessels were a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the Drukhari architecture. For a moment, there was a breathtaking silence, the calm before a hurricane. The Allied fleet moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a dancer. Bieltan's fleet, a vanguard of green and white blades, surged forward, their vampire raiders and hemlock wraith fighters streaking towards the smaller picket ships and weapon platforms. Ayandan's grand cruisers, ancient and majestic, formed the central battle line, their vast solar sails of blue and yellow unfurling to catch the dying star's light, their weapon ports glowing with nascent energy. And behind them, a silent bulwark of white, was the fleet of Annenvale, their psychic presence a tightly coiled spring of immense potential energy. The Drukhari response was instantaneous and utterly savage. The great portals did not open, they vomited. From the black maws poured a torrent of ships, a plague of metal locusts, torture-class cruisers, corsair frigates with sails of flayed skin, and swarms of razor-wing fighters and void-raven bombers. They did not form battle lines or adhere to any recognizable naval doctrine. They came as a wave of pure aggression, their engines screaming like tormented souls, their comms channels a cacophony of jeers, threats, and ecstatic cries for the slaughter to come. The first salvo was fired by Prince Iriel from the bridge of the final tier. All batteries, his voice was calm, the command of a being who had known nothing but war for centuries. Target the primary weapon arrays on the Gate of Woe. Let them know the children of Isha have returned for their lost kin. A wave of incandescent energy, the combined fire of a dozen pulsar lances crossed the void. The beams of pure light, impossibly bright in the gloom, struck the largest of the gate fortresses. Vast sections of its obsidian hide vaporized. Entire batteries of darklight cannons were slagged into molten ruin. The fortress did not shudder. It seemed to scream, a low psychic drone of outrage that washed over the Assyriani fleet. Then the Drukhari wave hit them. The battle became a maelstrom. It was a conflict of diametrically opposed philosophies. The Assyriani fought with precision, their every move calculated, their ships moving in interlocking patterns of fire and support. The Drukhari fought with spiteful, chaotic glee, their ships darting through the disciplined formations, looking for any weakness to exploit. A void-raven bomber would scream past an Ayandan cruiser, ignoring its main guns to drop a payload of implosion missiles against its delicate sensor spine. A flight of razor wings would harry a Bieltan frigate, not to destroy it, but to draw it out of formation where a lurking torture-class vessel could gut it with the volley of darklight lances that did not merely burn metal, but extinguish the souls of those they touched. Aboard the Bieltan strike carrier Blade of Kane, Autarch Ileana. Swiftblade watched the unfolding chaos on her command rune slate. "They fight like rabid animals," she hissed, her contempt a palpable force on the bridge. "No honor, no strategy, only hate." She targeted a squadron of enemy escorts that were preying on one of her cruisers. "Launch the Wild Riders, scour them from the void." From the blade of Kane's launch bays erupted, not fighters, but squadrons of jet bikes, their pilots weaving through the flak and energy beams with impossible skill, their shuriken catapults spitting monomolecular death at the unshielded bridges and engine blocks of the Drukhari ships. The cost, however, was immediate and brutal. An Eondan cruiser, the Spirit of Gnosis, was isolated. Its shields flared and died under a concentrated barrage, and then its hull was breached. Boarding torpedoes like barbed leeches slammed into its wraithbone flank. From them poured a tide of Wyches and Cabalite warriors, their blades thirsty. The battle for the ship was short and horrific. The living crew fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. A final, garbled Vox transmission reached the final tier, a mixture of screams and the chilling, triumphant laughter of the Drukhari before the Spirit of Gnosis went silent, its internal lights extinguished one by one. Uriel's face was a stone mask, but within the infinity circuit of his flagship, 1,000 silent voices cried out in grief. The true nature of the war was revealed in the psychic sphere. The Drukhari projected no cohesive psychic force, but their sheer collective pain, their delight in cruelty, and the agony of the countless slaves they used to power their machines created a static of pure misery that grated on the minds of the Asuryani psychers. It was a suffocating blanket of spiritual filth. Against this, the seers of the Dawnlight conquered fought a desperate battle. The warlocks of Biel-Tan formed psychic blades of pure thought, cutting through the static to protect their ships. The spirit seers of Eondan communed with their dead, drawing on their ancestral sorrow to create shields of impassive grief that the Drukhari's emotional poison could not penetrate. It was the conclave of Ani and Vael, however, that turned the tide. From his sanctum aboard Absolution's spear, Eldrion and his Farseers did not engage in the messy push and pull of the psychic battle. They performed a single devastatingly powerful rite. They reached into the skein of fate, not to read it, but to tear it. They located the threads of paranoia and ambition that bound the Drukhari commanders together and pulled them taut until they snapped. Suddenly, across the Drukhari fleet, alliances of convenience shattered. The Archon of the Cabal of the Blackened Heart, seeing the flagship of the Flayed Skull veer to protect him, perceived it as a move to steal his glory. He ordered his ships to fire on his allies. A succubus of the witch cult of strife, high on combat drugs, decided the moment of chaotic battle was the perfect time to assassinate her rival, and turned her entire wing of fighters against her sister cult ships. The Drukhari fleet began to cannibalize itself. Their greatest strength, their selfish individuality, had been turned into a fatal weakness. Seeing the enemy in disarray, Uriel seized the moment. All ships full power to the lances. Target the Gate of Woe's primary energy conduit. Break it now. The concentrated might of the Eondan battle line, reinforced by the surviving Biel-Tan vessels, focused into a single blinding spear of light. The beam struck the gate fortress at its heart. For a second, the obsidian structure seemed to absorb the energy, its surface glowing with a furious internal light. Then, with a silent psychic scream that was felt rather than heard, the gate of woe detonated. It was not a simple explosion. It was a rupture of reality. The gate, a stable bridge between real space and the webway, collapsed. A tidal wave of raw immaterium, the very stuff of the labyrinthine dimension, erupted into the system. The wave was not fire or radiation, but pure unreality. Ships caught in its path, both Asuryani and Drukhari, were unmade. Some were flash fossilized into crystalline statues of screaming metal. Others were turned inside out, their crews and machinery fused into obscene sculptures of flesh and wraithbone. The dying star's red light was momentarily consumed by a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shrieking non-sounds. The battle was over. The primary obsidian gate was shattered, its defenders annihilated or in panicked retreat back through the remaining smaller portals. The Dawnlight Conquered had won, but as Prince Iriel looked out from his command throne at the vista of devastation, he felt no triumph. The void was a graveyard. For every 10 shattered Drukhari hulls, he could count 3 of his own. The spirit of Gnosis was a dark, silent tomb. 2 Bieltan frigates were little more than expanding clouds of vaporized metal. The psychic stain of the gate's destruction hung in the system like a shroud, a permanent wound that would echo with torment for eternity. They had forced the door open, but the cost of that first step was a horror in itself, a price paid in the souls of their people and the very fabric of the universe. The war for Camorra had just begun, and its opening salvo had already poisoned a star system. The aftermath of the first battle was a wound in the webway itself. The Allied fleets navigated through psychic scar tissue, currents of echoing agony that whispered of the moment the obsidian gate was unmade. They moved through a corridor of ghosts, the silent screams of the slain clinging to the hulls of their ships like void frost. There was no celebration of their victory, only a grim, shared understanding of the price they had paid and the far greater price they were about to demand of themselves. Within the dome of crystal sorrows, now a mobile command nexus aboard Eldrian's flagship, the leaders of the Dawnlight Conquered convened. In the center of the chamber, a luminous ghost shimmered into existence, a 3-dimensional, fully sentient map of Camorra. It was not a static projection, but a living thing, a construct of psychic energy that swirled with the captured despair and malice of the Dark City. It showed a city of impossible scale, a knot of parasitic subrealms clinging to the arteries of the webway like cancerous growths. High Farseer Eldrian stood before the spectral city, his mirrored helm reflecting its tormented light. To strike at the core now would be folly, his thought voice echoed, cutting through the heavy silence. Camorra is not one city, but 1,000, each a fortress ruled by a petty tyrant. Its heart is shielded by layers of treachery and pain. To attack the center is to invite a war on 1,000,000 fronts, a war of attrition we cannot win. Prince Iriel, his gaze fixed on the seething mass of the map, nodded slowly. Our losses at the gate were significant. The ghost halls of Iandan have welcomed too many new residents. A direct assault would scour my craft world of its last living souls. The Swordwind does not fear a glorious death, Autarch Ileana countered, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. But even we do not throw lives away without purpose. We must bleed them, cripple them, before we aim for the throat. Precisely, Eldrian affirmed. The spectral map shifted, highlighting 3 massive satellite realms that orbited the central core of High Camorra like poison moons. The Dark City is a predator. Like any predator, it has vital organs that sustain it. We will not engage the beast head-on. We will sever its arteries. We will blind its eyes and starve its gullet. We will execute the Trifane assault. His gloved hand gestured, and the first of the sub-realms pulsed with a sickly green light. This is Sekmegra, the port of endless screams. It is the primary entry point for the slaves and plunder that fuel their entire society. It is a continent-sized dockyard, a flesh market, and a soul bazaar. It is the stomach of Camorra. Without it, the flow of resources will choke, and the lesser cabals who depend on it will fall into chaos, fighting over scraps. His mirrored helm turned towards Iriel. This will be a brutal, grinding war of conquest. Street by street, spire by spire, a task for those who do not tire, who feel no fear, and whose grief is a weapon. The wraith hosts of Eondin will take Sekmegra. Uriel's jaw tightened. It was a meat grinder, and Eldrian had just handed it to him. But the Farseer was right. The tireless, implacable advance of his ghost warriors and wraith knights was perfectly suited to such a horrific war of attrition. He gave a single sharp nod of assent. Eldrian gestured again, and a second realm glowed with the orange-black fire of a furnace. Zaylathon, the foundry of torment. Here, their weapons are forged, their combat drugs brewed, their vehicles of pain assembled. The Archons draw their power from the arsenals of Zaylathon. It is powered by pain engines that run on the agony of captured psychers. It is the fist of Camorra. The High Farseer's psychic gaze fell upon his own commanders. This realm will not be conquered. It will be unmade. The goal is pure destruction. Its forges must be shattered, its alchemical rivers ignited, its pain engines overloaded until they rupture reality. This is a task of cold psychic precision. The fleet of Anaean Vale will be its undoing. Finally, a third sub-realm, a place of deep shadows and flickering data streams, was illuminated. And this is Shaddam, the nexus of shadows. It is a web of observation spires, psychic relays, and scrying pools. From here, Vex spies watch the galaxy. From here, power is regulated, communications are controlled, and intelligence is gathered. It is the eyes and ears of the Dark City. Eldrian's attention turned to Ileana Swiftblade. To seize Shaddam is impossible. It is a maze of lies, but it can be blinded. A single decisive strike against its central power relays and scryer hubs could cast a third of the Dark City into darkness and confusion, severing Vect from his legions. It is a mission that requires unparalleled speed and aggression, a task for the Swordwind of Bieltan. Ileana's lips curled into a faint predatory smile. A spear-tip assault against the enemy's nerve center. It was the kind of battle for which she had been born. "It will be done," she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. The plan was set. The great armada, the hope of the Aeldari, would divide its strength, gambling everything on this three-pronged attack. The fleets maneuvered in the haunted void, parting ways with solemn grace. Uriel's great blue and yellow ships, a fleet of ghosts and their living masters, peeled off towards a shimmering tier in the Webway that pulsed with a faint, screaming chorus. The stark white vessels of Ananvial, silent and ominous, turned towards a portal that flickered with the light of distant hellish fires. Ileana's green and white fleet, bristling with aggression, aimed for a gate that was a vortex of pure darkness, a place where light itself seemed to die. As his fleet passed through the portal into the arterial tunnel leading to Sekmegra, Prince Iriel stood on the bridge of his flagship. The transition was jarring. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of ancient suffering. The walls of the Webway tunnel here were not smooth, but coated in a psychic residue of misery, the collective terror of trillions of captured souls that had passed this way. Through the forward viewports he saw it, a city that hung in a void of its own making, illuminated by the cold corpse light of captured stars. Sprawling docks large enough to swallow fleets whole were connected by chains of groaning metal to towering spires carved from the bones of some forgotten star god. He could hear it even through the hull of his ship and the silence of the void, a low, constant hum of agony that was the city's lifeblood. Simultaneously, the Aenean Vial fleet entered the passage to Zaylathon. The temperature on their bridges rose perceptibly. The Webway tunnel here was a tube of scorched, cracked crystal, vibrating with the percussive rhythm of a billion hammers. The light was harsh, casting everything in a brutal orange glare. Zaylathon was not a city, but a continent-sized engine of war, a landscape of towering foundries that belched chemical smog, rivers of molten metal, and mountains of discarded war machines. The air itself tasted of ozone and smelted rage. And far from them, the Biel-Tan swordwind burst into the corridor of Shaddam. Here there was no sound, no light, only a profound and oppressive silence. It was a realm of inverted spires hanging from a ceiling of shadow, all connected by webs of solidified darkness. The only illumination came from pulsing psychic relays, running like veins of cold blue light through the architecture of malice. Autarch Ileana Swiftblade felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This was a place of secrets and unseen threats, where a single misstep could mean an eternity of torment. 3 fleets, 3 targets, 3 vital organs of the Dark City. In 3 separate yet simultaneous moments, the forces of the Dawnlight Concord began their invasions. Across the vast, non-linear spaces of the Webway, the Trifane assault had begun, a move of such breathtaking audacity that it would either shatter the power of Camorra forever, or ensure the final bloody damnation of the Asuriani race. The air in Sekmegra was a poisonous cocktail of industrial effluvium, recycled fear, and the cloying metallic scent of spilled blood. It was a place that had not known a natural sky for millennia. Instead, a ceiling of tarnished brass and vertigrized conduits wept a constant greasy rain, illuminated by the sickly green glow of immense soul cages where captured psychers burned in slow, perpetual agony. This was the crucible Prince Iriel had been given, a world-sized port built on a foundation of torment. His fleet hung in the void above the city's highest spires, a constellation of defiant blue and yellow against the oppressive gloom. From their bellies descended the first wave, an army of the living and the dead, come to throttle the gullet of the dark city. The initial landings were a testament to Assyriani precision and power. Wave serpents and falcon grav tanks, their engines humming a stark contrast to the city's screaming ambience, descended upon the grand ossuary dock, a landing platform miles long and wide, built from the petrified skeletons of void whales. They moved in perfect flowing formations, their shuriken cannons and bright lances scything through the first wave of disorganized Cabalite defenders who had scrambled from their garrisons. The Drukhari, accustomed to chaotic raids and piratical skirmishes, were momentarily stunned by this display of formal, disciplined warfare. Then, from the teleportation flares and shimmering portals that opened on the dock, came the heart of Ayandan's army, the Wraith hosts. They appeared in silence, squads of Wraith Guard, their heavy forms implacable, their faceless helms surveying the battlefield with unnerving stillness before raising their immense Wraith cannons. The air distorted around the muzzles of their weapons as they fired, erasing entire squads of Drukhari from existence, not with explosive force, but by shunting them directly into the warp. Towering over them were the Wraith Lords, ancient heroes of Ayandan housed in elegant, monstrous frames of wraithbone. They strode through the splinter rifle fire as if it were rain, their ghost glaives cleaving Drukhari raiders in two, their heavy cannons blasting fortified positions into rubble. The initial Drukhari defense shattered. For a few precious hours, the advance was relentless. The Aeondan forces, a tide of silent ghosts and grim-faced guardians, pushed off the grand ossuary dock and into the first of the great boulevards, the promenade of flayed banners. It was a street fighting of unparalleled brutality. Guardians took cover behind pillars carved into scenes of exquisite torture, their shurikens chipping away at the barbed architecture as they traded fire with Cabalites lurking in shadowed archways. But Sekmaegra was a beast that learned quickly. The Archon of the port, a bloated creature named Zylark, who ruled from his spire of living flesh, did not meet strength with strength. He met it with the city's inherent malice. The grand boulevards were revealed to be traps. Sections of the promenade collapsed into pits lined with rusted blades, swallowing falcon grav tanks whole. A fine aerosolized poison, tasteless and invisible, was pumped into the air, a neurotoxin that did not affect the hardened Drukhari, but caused the living guardians to suffer agonizing seizures. Their own advanced physiology turned against them. The true counterattack, however, came from the witch cults. From the vertical slums that clung to the sides of the city's spires, they descended. Hellions on their skyboards swarmed the Aeondan flanks, their splinter pods spitting a hail of toxic shards. Reaver jet bikes, faster than anything the Assyriani could field, screamed through the canyons between buildings, their riders slashing at tank commanders and exposed infantry with blade veins. Wyches, impossibly fast and graceful, ran along walls and swung from chains, their bodies a blur of motion. They did not engage the Wraith Guard in contests of strength. They flowed around them, a river of blades seeking the gaps. They swarmed the Wraith Lords, dozens of them at a time, their agonizers and hydra gauntlets seeking the delicate spirit stones that were the construct's only true vulnerability. The war became a grind. Every intersection was a fortress, every plaza a killing field. The silent, methodical advance of the wraith hosts was bogged down in a tide of disposable bodies and sadistic traps. Zylark threw waves of captured slaves at the Ayandan lines, wretched aliens and humans armed with crude weapons, their bodies pumped full of combat drugs that drove them into a suicidal frenzy. The Guardians were forced to mow down these pitiful creatures, their own empathic souls recoiling at the slaughter, while Drukhari snipers picked them off from spires a mile high. The psychic toll was immense. On a captured balcony overlooking a plaza choked with the dead, Spirit Seer Ayana led her conclave. Her eyes were closed, her mind a nexus point for the souls of a dozen Wraithguard squads. She felt the cold, patient sorrow of the dead heroes within the stones. She guided their actions, filtered their perceptions, and shielded their spirits from the overwhelming psychic filth of the city. But the agony of Sekmaegra was a physical force, a constant pressure on her mind. She could feel the echoes of every torment, every scream, every last despairing breath of the trillions who had suffered and died here. It was like trying to think in the heart of a vortex. One of her acolytes suddenly screamed, clutching his head, blood pouring from his eyes. He had lost control. The 5 Wraithguard under his guidance instantly went inert, collapsing to the ground like puppets with their strings cut, moments before a Ravager dark lance blew them into incandescent fragments. From the command deck of the final tier, Prince Ariel watched the rune displays with a heavy heart. Blue lights, representing his warriors, were winking out at an alarming rate. The advance had stalled. The initial beachhead was secure, but they were now caught in a war of attrition they could not possibly win. They had the strength, but the Drukhari had the numbers and a home field advantage that was literally poisoning his army. He made a decision that felt like a desecration. Awaken the Knights of the Aether, all of them. We will break their line at the bridge of final lament, or we will die on its threshold. It was an order of last resort. Deep within the wraith halls of the final tier and its attendant cruisers, the greatest of the dead were stirred. These were not mere heroes, they were legends, the pilots of the god machines of the Aeldari, the Wraith Knights. On the battlefield, their arrival was heralded by a shift in the psychic atmosphere. The grinding misery of the city was momentarily pierced by something else, a cold, focused rage that was ancient and absolute. Then they came, 6 of them, teleporting directly into the heart of the stalled battle at the bridge of final lament, a vast causeway spanning a chasm filled with writhing half-dead things. The Wraith Knights were titans of Wraithbone, moving with a speed and grace that defied their colossal size. The battle stopped for a heartbeat as both sides stared in awe and terror. Then the slaughter began. A Wraith Knight armed with a sun cannon fired and a beam of miniature solar fire vaporized a quarter mile of the bridge, along with 3 Ravagers and hundreds of Drukhari warriors. Another, wielding a titanic ghost glaive and a scatter shield, charged directly into the densest part of the enemy line. It moved like a legendary hero from the myths of old, its blade carving arcs of destruction, its shield deflecting dark light blasts that could cripple a cruiser. Raiders were swatted from the air like insects. Talos pain engines were stomped into heaps of scrap metal and twitching flesh. The Drukhari line at the bridge did not bend. It evaporated. Their cruelty and cunning were no match for the sheer focused power of these demigods of war. The path was cleared. The Eondan forces surged forward, securing the far side of the chasm and establishing a new, far deeper foothold into the city's defenses. But the victory felt as bitter as ash. As Prince Ariel watched the Wraith Knights stand sentinel over the newly won ground, he saw not glorious war machines, but tombs. Within each construct was a pair of souls, twins from Eondon's noble houses, one living, one dead, forever bound in an echo of life to pilot the machine. He had summoned these revered spirits, these tragic legends, from their peace to wade through the filth and carnage of this depraved city. He had won the battle for the bridge, but in doing so, he had further mortgaged the soul of his dying world. The crucible of Sekmegra had claimed its first major payment, and the cost was written in the ghosts of heroes. While the grinding war of attrition consumed Ayandon in Sekmegra, the battle for Shaddam was a conflict of an entirely different nature. It was not a war of territory or resources, but a war of shadows, speed, and a single defining purpose. Shaddam, the nexus of shadows, was a silent, lightless realm of inverted spires, where information was the only currency and sight was a liability. The forces of Bieltan, the Swordwind, did not descend en masse. To do so would be to mire themselves in a labyrinth from which there was no escape. Instead, Autarch Ileana Swiftblade enacted a strategy of pure, uncompromising aggression. A single overwhelming spearhead aimed at the heart of the Nexus. Her fleet remained in high orbit, a menacing constellation of green and white, launching waves of diversionary attacks against secondary spires and phantom weapon emplacements. These were feints designed to draw the attention of the realm's defenders, to make them believe a conventional invasion was underway. But the true attack came from a single point, a border personal strike carrier, the Blade of Kane. Here, she had gathered the very elite of her craft world's aspect shrines, fire dragons, their armor the color of cooling magma, swooping hawks, their wings rippling with captured light, striking scorpions cloaked in shadow, and at their heart a phalanx of dire avengers, their crested helms a sea of regal blue. This was not an army, it was a scalpel honed to perfection. The scryers of Anayan Vial have given us a path, Ileana announced on the humming embarkation deck, her voice sharp and clear over the comm link, cutting through the low thrum of grav engines. She stood before them, her armor gleaming, her sun-shard blade held at her side like a sliver of a captured star. She wore no helm, her stark white hair a banner of defiance, her eyes burning with the zealot's fire. It is a path that will be open for a breath's span. It leads directly to the primary power conduit of the central scryer hub, the Oculus Noctis. We will not be subtle. We will not be silent. We will be a thunderbolt that cracks this spire of lies from top to bottom, for the glory of Bieltan, for the future of our race. A unified cry of, "For the reborn empire," echoed from the assembled warriors, a sound of absolute unwavering conviction. The assault began. It did not use dropships or teleporters, which could be tracked and intercepted. Instead, the Blade of Kane executed a maneuver of suicidal audacity. It plunged into the upper atmosphere of Shaddam, its shields screaming as they scraped against the realm's defensive energy fields. For a few terrifying seconds, the massive carrier was a comet of green and white fire. Then, its ventral launch bays snapped open, and the entire strike force deployed in a single, breathtaking wave. Wave serpents and falcons loaded with aspect warriors dove towards the Oculus Noctis, a single impossibly tall spire that served as the backbone of the entire subrealm. The reaction from the defenders was swift, but Ileana had planned for it. As flights of Razorwing fighters and Voidraven bombers rose to intercept, the skies filled with the white-winged forms of swooping hawks. They met the Drukhari fighters in a dizzying three-dimensional dogfight, their lass blasters stitching patterns of light through the darkness, their grenade packs dropping haywire charges that sent enemy aircraft spinning into the spires below. They were a screen of living chaff, buying the ground assault precious moments. Ileana's own wave serpent, the Glimmerfang, led the charge. It jinked and weaved through a storm of darklight fire, its twin shuriken cannons spitting defiance. They slammed onto the primary landing platform of the Oculus Noctis, not with a gentle landing but a controlled crash, using their momentum to plow directly through the first line of Kabalite sentinels. The assault ramp dropped before the transport had even skidded to a halt. "No mercy," Ileana roared, leaping out and igniting her sunshard blade. The air hissed as the weapon of legend flared to life. What followed was not a battle, but a purge. The Drukhari on the platform, expecting a siege, were instead met with a whirlwind of focused destruction. Fire dragons leapt from their transports, their meltaguns turning defensive turrets and enemy vehicles into molten slag with single perfectly placed shots. Striking scorpions materialized from the shadows at the base of the spire, their mandiblasters stunning the guards before their chainswords bit deep into flesh and armor. The dire avengers, led by Ileana herself, formed the unbreakable core of the assault, advancing in a perfect line, their shuriken catapults firing in synchronized volleys that were impossible to dodge, a storm of monomolecular discs that flinched warriors from their bones in seconds. The interior of the Oculus Noctis was a nightmare of shifting corridors and optical illusions, but the Bieltan warriors were guided by the psychic pathfinding of the Anean Veil Seers, a shimmering thread of green light in their mind's eye that led them ever downwards directly towards the spire's power core. They fought through chambers filled with slave psychers whose eyes had been replaced with crystal lenses, through data vaults where screams were cataloged on flayed scrolls, and across bridges that spanned chasms of pure swirling shadow. The Drukhari defenders, members of the elite cabal of the Shadowed Thorn, were masters of stealth and ambush, but they were individualists, predators fighting for their own glory. They fought against a single unified organism of war. An ambush of mandrakes was met by the searing flames of a fire dragon squad that seemed to anticipate their every move. A barricade defended by elite Trueborn warriors was bypassed by swooping hawks who simply flew down the central shaft of the spire, attacking from above. But finally, they reached the heart of the spire, the chamber of the final relay. It was a vast spherical room, its walls lined with colossal pulsing crystals that channeled the power and information for the entire realm. In the center, suspended in an anti-gravity field, was the Master Crystal, a flawless black gem the size of a battle tank. Guarding it was the Archon of the Shadowed Thorn, a lithe figure in Baroque armor, flanked by a retinue of hulking incubi. "You are bold, little hawk," the Archon sneered, his voice a silky whisper amplified by his helm, "to fly so deep into the web." Ileana did not reply with words. She raised her blade and charged. The dire avengers engaged the Cabalites, their disciplined volleys a stark contrast to the wild firing of their foes. The striking scorpions and fire dragons held the entrances, preventing any reinforcements. It all came down to the duel at the center. The incubi moved to intercept Ileana, their claves humming with lethal energy. They were said to be the finest duelists in the galaxy, their every move an expression of lethal perfection. They were not prepared for the sheer, focused fury of a Bieltan autarch. Ileana became a blur of green and white. She did not fight them one by one. She moved through them, her sun-shard blade a continuous arc of light. A parry became a disemboweling slash. A sidestep flowed into a decapitating strike. In 5 seconds, the entire incubus retinue lay in pieces on the floor. The Archon stared, his arrogance momentarily shattered. That hesitation was his last. Ileana leapt, her jump pack firing in a short, brutal burst. She brought the sun-shard blade down in a two-handed overhead strike. The Archon's desperate parry was shattered, his dark light-laced armor cleaved in two. He fell without a sound. Ileana's swift blade landed before the Master Crystal, her warriors having already annihilated the remaining defenders. There was no time for ceremony. "Fire dragons," she commanded, her voice ringing in the sudden silence. "Make it beautiful." The squad of fire dragons stepped forward, raised their melta guns, and fired as one. A concentrated beam of thermonuclear fury struck the Master Crystal. For a moment, it absorbed the energy, glowing with an impossible blinding light. Then, with a soundless crack that shattered every crystal in the chamber, it exploded. The power relays of Shaddam were severed. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Across 1/3 of the Dark City, the lights went out, communication networks dissolved into static, scrying pools went black, surveillance systems died. The ever-present hum of power that was the lifeblood of Kamara fell silent in 1,000 districts. Vect was blinded. Panic and paranoia, the natural state of the Drukhari, erupted into open warfare as rival cabals took advantage of the darkness to settle old scores. High above, aboard her carrier, Ileana watched the results on her command slate. 1/3 of the spectral map of Camorra had gone dark. Her mission was a staggering success, achieved with minimal casualties. Her daring, her speed, and her utter refusal to compromise had dealt a crippling blow to the enemy. From that day on, in the hushed whispers of her own people and the terrified curses of the Drukhari, she would be known by the name of her wave serpent, the one that led the charge. She was Glimmerfang, the blade that had blinded the eye of the tyrant. A legend had been forged in the spiteful dark of Shaddam. In the chlorite spire, the personal panopticon of Asdrubal Vect, the sudden darkness that consumed 1/3 of his domain was not met with panic, but with a profound and chilling silence. Vect sat upon his throne of stolen cries, a construct of psychically resonant agony, and observed the chaos on his remaining scryer pools. He watched cabals turn on one another in the darkened districts, saw the grinding attrition of Ayandan's forces in Sek Megra, and noted the precise surgical destruction of the forges in Zay-Lathan by the eerie white ships. He saw it all not as a crisis, but as a fascinating new strategic problem. For millennia, he had played the game of intrigue and betrayal within Kamara. Now his long-lost cousins had brought him a new, more stimulating contest, A lesser tyrant would have responded with overwhelming force, unleashing his personal legions to crush the invaders. But Asdrubal Vecht had not ruled the Dark City for 10,000 years through brute strength. He ruled through an understanding of pain, not just of the body, but of the soul. He knew the Azuriani. He knew their pride, their grief, and their most sacred, cherished weakness, their dead. They believe they are waging a war of gods and empires, Vecht murmured to himself, his voice a dry rustle of ancient malice. A slender hand, its fingers tipped with razor-sharp silver nails, reached out and plucked a screaming soul trap from a nearby pedestal. He held the fist-sized crystal to his ear, listening to the faint, ethereal cries within. They are merely children, throwing tantrums in the dark. It is time for their lesson to begin. He did not summon his generals or fleet masters. He summoned Lilith Hesperax, the undisputed queen of the witch cults, and Urian Rakarth, the master homunculus and architect of flesh. They materialized in his throne room like phantoms. Lilith, a vision of deadly grace. Urian, a grotesque parody of life held together by tubes and surgical steel. My Lord Vecht, Lilith purred, her every movement a promise of exquisite violence. The children of the stars have broken some of your toys. Toys can be replaced, Vecht replied, his gaze still fixed on the chaotic displays. But their arrogance, their sentimental piety, that is a resource to be cultivated. He turned his ancient, intelligent eyes to Rakarth. Master of the Coven, you have long experimented with the echoes left by souls, have you not? The psychic residue of spirit stones. Urian Rakarth's collection of mouths split into a dozen different smiles. A fascinating field. The crystalline matrix of Wraithbone holds a psychic imprint, a ghost of the soul it once housed. A pathetic sentimental echo, but one that can be agitated. Excellent, Vecht said. And Lilith, my queen of blades, your cult of strife, has acquired countless craft-worlder bodies over the centuries, I trust. Lilith's smile widened. We have an extensive collection of their porcelain dolls, so very easy to break. Good. Vecht's voice was now laced with a chilling, creative glee. Rakarth, I want you to create a contagion, not of the flesh, but of the spirit, a psychic toxin tailored to the specific resonant frequency of the Azuriani infinity circuits. It will be an agent of corruption, an accelerant for grief, and Lilith, you will provide the delivery system. Have your most skilled witches prepare for a special hunt. I do not want them to kill the enemy. I want them to harvest their soul stones. This was the birth of Vecht's Mirror Gambit. It was a counter-offensive of unimaginable cruelty, a weapon aimed not at ships or armies, but at the very heart of the craft-worlder's culture and hope. The plan was enacted with terrifying speed and efficiency in the laboratories of the homunculi. Urian Rakarth distilled the essence of 1,000 captured soul stones, twisting their inherent sorrow and serenity into a viral strain of pure psychic despair. It was a non-physical plague, a sequence of corrupting thoughts and whispers that, when introduced to an infinity circuit, would act like a key turning in a lock, unlocking the gates that kept the dead placid and at peace. The delivery was Lilith's masterpiece. She did not engage the main Assyriani fleets. She dispatched elite hunting parties of witches on the swift, silent vessels. They stalked the edges of the great battles, preying on isolated ships and downed fighter pilots. Their mission was singular: bypass the living and steal the soul stones from the fallen. In the chaos of the war, the losses were at first unnoticed. A guardian squad, stones not recovered, a wraith guard's central matrix shattered and looted, a fallen pilot's gem-studded armor stripped from his corpse. Each stolen stone was a tragic but accepted loss of war. Each was brought back to Rakarth's labs. There the homunculi performed their foul work. They did not destroy the stones. They infected them. They used their arcane flesh-crafting sciences to pry open the psychic shells of the gems and inject Rakarth's contagion directly into the captured spirit within. The soul of the fallen Assyriani hero was twisted. Its grief turned to rage. Its peace turned to shrieking madness. The stone itself, once a symbol of hope and continuity, was now a psychic bomb. Then came the final, most insidious phase of the plan. Drukhari slave raiders' disposable assets were given the corrupted soul stones. They were sent on suicide runs, their ships streaking towards the grand cruisers of Eondon and the carriers of Bieltan. Most were destroyed by the Assyriani fleet screens, their mission a seeming failure. But their true purpose was not to attack. It was to die close enough. When their ships were destroyed, the corrupted soul stones were scattered into the void, adrift in the war zone. The Assyriani, driven by their deepest instinct, dutifully retrieved the stones of their fallen brethren. Every recovery was a moment of solemn success, a soul saved from the hunger of Slaanesh, and every recovered stone was a vial of poison brought aboard their ships. The effect was not immediate. The contagion was a slow-acting virus. But as the infected stones were integrated into the infinity circuits of the Assyriani vessels, the plague began to spread. At first it was just a whisper. A spirit seer aboard an Eondon cruiser would feel a flicker of unease from the wraith-bone core of the ship, a discordant note in the endless song of the dead. A warlock on a Bieltan bridge would suffer a sudden sharp migraine, a flash of a hateful, unfamiliar memory that was not his own. Then the whispers became screams. Aboard the Bieltan carrier, Blade of Kane, a revered Wraithguard squad, standing silent sentinel in its ancestral hall, suddenly activated without a spirit seer's command. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent red light instead of the soft white of ancestral spirits. They raised their wraith cannons and fired into the other inert constructs, their actions driven by a blind, hateful rage. The ship's internal corridors became a war zone as aspect warriors were forced to fight their own revered dead. The plague was far worse for Eondon. Their ships were more than vessels. They were mobile mausoleums, their infinity circuits vast and interconnected with the core of the craft world itself. Prince Iriel was on the bridge of the final tier when the first true manifestation occurred. The ship's wraithbone bulkheads began to weep, a black, oily psychic residue. Ghostly apparitions flickered in the corridors, not the calm, ethereal ancestors they were used to, but shrieking, distorted parodies of Aeldari, their faces frozen in masks of eternal rage. The great infinity circuit, the repository of Eondon's entire history and population, began to broadcast a chorus of madness directly into the minds of every living crew member. Seers clutched their heads and collapsed, their minds shattered by the psychic assault. Guardians fell to their knees, weeping as the voices of their own grandmothers cursed them and screamed for release. Vex's mirror gambit was a stroke of genius born from pure, unadulterated malice. He had not broken their fleets or their armies. He had poisoned their souls. He had taken their greatest strength, their reverence for the dead, and turned it into a weapon that was tearing them apart from the inside. The war was no longer just against the Drukhari. It was now a war against the ghosts of their own past, a battle against the corrupted memory of everyone they had ever loved and lost. The dawnlight conquered, already bleeding in the meat grinders of Camorra, was now being devoured by its own heart. As the dawnlight conquered reeled from the psychic poison corrupting their fleets, a new fleet emerged from the tortured arteries of the webway. These were not the stark, functional ships of the Concord, nor the barbed monstrosities of the Drukhari. Their hulls were a swirl of deepest black, vibrant red, and ghostly white. At their head was a vessel of unique design, the Yniad's Dream, part Bieltan's swordship, part corsair vessel, and part something entirely new, its wraith bone seeming to flow and reshape itself with every passing moment. This was the fleet of the Inari, the followers of the Whispering God, and their arrival was not the coming of an ally, but the arrival of a judge. At their head stood the triumvirate of Yniad, Yvraine, the emissary, her raven hair streaked with silver, the crone-zored Kavir humming at her side, her very presence a vortex of life and death. The Vizarch, her silent champion, clad in ancient armor, his gaze heavy with the weight of ages and sorrows, and most shockingly, striding alongside them on the bridge of their flagship was a figure of living myth, Jane Czar, the Phoenix Lord of the Howling Banshees, her scream mask a silent promise of death. Their arrival sent a psychic shockwave through the warring fleets, a presence that was at once familiar and deeply alien. Yvraine did not request a parley. She commanded one. A psychic message imbued with the nascent power of her god cut through the chaos of battle and the madness of Vex's plague. It reached Eldrion, Uriel, and Ileana directly, a voice that was at once 1,000 whispers and a single clear command. Cease this madness. You are not birthing a god. You are digging a grave for our entire race. The meeting took place in the neutral void between the fleets aboard Yvraine's flagship. It was a tense, hostile affair. Prince Iriel was weary, the psychic screams of his ancestors a constant torment in his mind. Autarch Ileana was defiant, her face a mask of cold fury, viewing this interruption as a betrayal of their holy cause. High Farseer Eldrion was a pillar of unnerving calm, his mirrored helm betraying nothing, his psychic presence a shield of absolute conviction. You speak of madness, emissary, Ileana began, her voice sharp. We are on the cusp of delivering our people from the great enemy. We are enacting a necessary, glorious sacrifice that will save us all. And you come to us now, speaking of graves. I speak of the path of damnation, Yvraine retorted, her dark eyes flashing. She gestured to the shimmering void outside the viewport, towards the spectral wound that was Camorra. I am the chosen of Yniad. I feel his stirrings, his pain. The God you seek to awaken is one of balance, of the final peaceful transition of the soul from life into death, and from death into a new beginning. It is a cycle. What you are doing here is not a cycle, it is a psychic abomination. It is a prophecy. Eldrian's thought voice stated, cold and immutable. The chime of soulless bells is the final verse, a sacrifice of the soulless to give life to the God of souls. The logic is absolute. There is no logic in suicide. Ivrain's voice rose, laced with the chilling power of the God she served. The lights on the bridge flickered. The Drukhari are not soulless. That is a comforting lie we have told ourselves for millennia. Their souls are shrunken, withered, addicted to the pain of others to stave off the thirst. But they are Aeldari souls nonetheless. To extinguish 1 trillion of them in a single violent moment is not a sacrifice. It is a psychic detonation. You will not give birth to Ennead. You will create a psychic black hole, a vortex of death energy so vast it will cripple the webway and draw the full, undivided attention of she who thirsts. Uriel, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice raspy with fatigue and grief. Vect has poisoned our infinity circuits. Our dead attack the living. We are dying, emissary. This Farseer's plan may be monstrous, but it is a hope. What hope do you offer in its place? I offer the true path, Ivrain said, her tone softening slightly as she looked at the haunted prince. A slow gathering, a rejoining of our peoples. The awakening of Ennead must be a choice, a willing passage, not a slaughter. We have been working to unite the strands of our race, Asuriani, Drukhari, and Harlequin alike. This crusade spits on that work. It proves to the lost in Komorag that we are no better than they are, that we see them only as fuel for our pyre. They are a cancer, Ileana spat. You do not reason with a cancer, you cut it out. It was then that Jane Czar stepped forward. The Phoenix Lord, a being of myth and legend, removed her helm. Her face was ancient and beautiful, but etched with a sorrow that could shatter mountains. I have walked the path of the warrior for longer than your craft world has sailed the stars, autarch of Bieltan. Her voice was a melodic whisper that held the chilling promise of a death scream. I have seen our empire rise and fall. I have watched our people divide. This path you walk is the path of the fall. It is the same pride, the same belief in your own infallibility that doomed our ancestors. You have mistaken atrocity for necessity. The summit was a failure. The Dawnlight conquered was too committed, too steeped in blood and loss to turn back. Eldrian's conviction was absolute. Ileana's zealotry was unbreakable, and Iriel was trapped between damnation and annihilation, with no good choices left. They returned to their ships, the battle lines not just drawn, but deepened. The war was no longer a simple, brutal conflict between Craftworlder and Drukhari. It was now a three-sided schism, a civil war within a civil war. The Inari did not leave. Their fleet took up a strategic position, a blockade not against the Drukhari, but against the conquered. Ivrain's followers began a campaign of surgical sabotage. Inari-aligned corsair bands, once allies of the Drukhari, now turned on them, but they also raided the conquered supply lines. Small elite forces of Inari warriors, including a handful of converted incubi and Wyches, launched lightning raids into the war zones of Sekmegra and Shaddam. They did not attack the Eondan or Bieltan forces directly. Instead, they created chaos. They freed slaves who then turned on their masters and the invaders alike. They destroyed key objectives before the conquered forces could reach them, slowing their advance. They spread Yvraine's message amongst the disaffected of both sides, a whisper of a third way, a path away from the mutual destruction. The war for Camorra descended into a new layer of hell. On the poisoned ground of Sec Maegra, Ayandan wraith constructs now found themselves fighting not only Kabbalites and Wyches, but also fanatical death cults of freed aliens, all while being harried by the shrieking ghosts of their own corrupted ancestors. In the ruins of Shah Dam, Ileana's forces, attempting to consolidate their victory, were beset by hit-and-run attacks from Inari shadow warriors who seemed to know their every move, vanishing into the darkness before a proper response could be mounted. The schism of the Whispering God was complete. Yvraine, in her attempt to prevent a great tragedy, had inadvertently added another layer of complexity and bloodshed to the conflict. The Aeldari, a race on the brink of extinction, were now locked in a three-way war of annihilation in the heart of their own darkest reflection, each faction utterly convinced that their path was the only one to salvation, even if it meant destroying the others to achieve it. The dream of a united Aeldari people, the very purpose of Inead's birth, was being torn to shreds in the very crucible that was meant to forge it. War on a cosmic scale is not a matter of glorious charges and heroic duels. It is a ravenous, insatiable machine of logistics. For every aspect warrior carving a bloody path through the enemy, there are 100 unseen souls toiling in the engine rooms, the manufactorums, and the hydroponic farms of the fleet. The war for Camorra was a beast that devoured not just lives, but resources, hope, and sanity. The weight of this endless conflict began to press down on the Dawn Light conquered, threatening to crush them long before the Drukhari blades ever could. The sheer, grinding cost of the war became a foe in itself, as implacable and deadly as any Archon. Aboard the Eandan flagship, Prince Uriel stood before a tactical display that no longer showed enemy positions but the lifeblood of his own craft world. The runes glowed with an ominous amber light. Ammunition yields were down by 60%. The wraithbone armatures for new constructs were cracking under the strains of rapid forging, their psychic matrices flawed and unstable. The soul forges, where spirit stones were prepared and set, were overwhelmed. For every warrior who fell, the spirit seers had to perform the complex, draining ritual of guiding their soul into their stone, a task made 100 times more difficult by the psychic filth of Camorra and the insidious madness of Vex Plague. They were losing more souls to the void, to the thirst of Slaanesh, than at any time since the Hive Fleet Kraken disaster. His people were starving. The great biodomes of Eandan, carefully cultivated over millennia to sustain its population, were not designed to support a full-scale, indefinite war effort. The fleet had been provisioned for a swift, decisive campaign. This was not that. Rations were cut, then cut again. The living warriors, the guardians and rangers, grew gaunt, their faces pale and drawn beneath their helmets. Their legendary battle focus began to fray at the edges, replaced by a weary desperation. The dream of a swift victory had died, replaced by a waking nightmare of endless attritional warfare. The weight was heaviest in the silent halls of the dead. The Infinity Circuit, the very soul of Eandan, was sick. Vect's contagion was a cancer, and the constant influx of new, grieving spirits from the battlefields was the food upon which it feasted. The circuit was becoming a charnel house of shrieking, agonized ghosts. Spirit seers worked themselves to exhaustion, their bodies wasting away as they spent weeks on end in deep trances, trying to build psychic firewalls, to quarantine the maddened spirits, to soothe the eternal torment. More than one never woke up, their minds simply dissolving under the strain. The Wraith hosts, Ayondan's primary weapon, were becoming unreliable. A Wraith Lord would sometimes freeze mid-battle, its animating spirit lost in a cacophony of internal screams. A squad of Wraith Guard would turn on its own allies, its targeting runes corrupted by the echoes of rage from the circuit. Eondon was a ghost-haunted world fighting a war with an army of ghosts, and now the ghosts were turning against them. For BL10, the cost was measured not in resources but in blood. The Swordwind was a warrior culture, its population dedicated to the path of the warrior, but they were still a dwindling race. Every aspect warrior was the culmination of centuries of training and irreplaceable treasure. And they were being spent like currency in the dark alleys of the Dark City. Autarch Ileana Swiftblade received the reports, her face an impassive mask that hid a growing chasm of despair. The Fire Dragon Shrine was at 50% strength. The swooping hawk flocks had been decimated. Even the striking scorpions, masters of stealth, were suffering irreplaceable losses in the three-way shadow war against Drukhari and Inari infiltrators. Bieltan's society was reconfiguring itself for total war. Exarchs who had retired to paths of artistry or contemplation were recalled to their shrines, their hands, once accustomed to shaping clay or plucking the strings of a harp, now once again gripping the weapons of their bloody trade. Young Aeldari, barely more than children, were being rushed through their training, their time on the path of the warrior, a frantic, brutal sprint, rather than a lifetime of disciplined study. The very concept of the path, the philosophical core of Craftworld society, was being sacrificed for the sake of victory. They were becoming a standing army with no civilians left, a generation of warriors who would know nothing but this single, all-consuming crusade. If they won, what would be left of the culture they had fought to preserve? They would have saved the body of their craft world by sacrificing its soul. The fleet of Anon Vale seemed immune to this decay. Their ships remained pristine, their warriors disciplined, their purpose unwavering, but their cost was of a different, more chilling kind. They did not seem to suffer from Vect's plague, nor did they show signs of resource depletion. This was because Aenean Vale was already a ghost. Its biodomes were barren, its civilian halls were silent. There were no artists, no thinkers, no dreamers. There were only warriors and seers. Every single member of the craft world's population, utterly dedicated to Eldrion's apocalyptic vision. They had been paying the cost of this war for centuries before it even began, stripping their society down to nothing but a weapon, a sacrificial knife aimed at the heart of Kamarag. Their immunity was not a sign of strength, but of a decay so advanced it had reached a state of terrible, cold perfection. They had nothing left to lose but the war itself. The logistical nightmare extended to the very machines of war. Wraithbone, the psychoplastic material from which the Assyriani built everything, was not infinitely resilient. It was grown, not manufactured, and it responded to the psychic state of its users. Under the constant strain of negative emotion, the grief of Eondon, the rage of Bieltan, the cold fanaticism of Ananvael, the hulls of their ships began to degrade. Hair-sline cracks would appear on conduits. Weapons would misfire. Engines would lose power at critical moments. The fleet was literally groaning under the weight of its own sorrow and hate. Bone singers worked frantically, their psychic songs of repair becoming hoarse and strained as they tried to heal a fleet that was being spiritually wounded faster than they could mend it. This was the unseen, unglamorous reality of the Dawnlight Concord's crusade. It was a war fought not just on the battlefield, but in the granaries, the soul forges, and the tormented minds of every living Aeldari. They had come to Comorag as a proud, shining armada, the last best hope of their race. Now they were a tattered, starving, and half-mad remnant, haunted by their own dead and shackled to a war that was consuming them from the inside out. The victory they sought seemed more distant than ever, and the price of simply continuing the fight was rising to a level that would leave the victor indistinguishable from the vanquished. The war had reached a state of malignant equilibrium. The Dawnlight Concord was bleeding out, their fleets corrupted, their armies mired in a multi-front nightmare. Comora was crippled but defiant, its capacity for cruelty seemingly infinite. The Inari were a persistent thorn, preventing either side from gaining a decisive advantage. The conflict was no longer a crusade, it was a festering wound, a self-sustaining vortex of death that threatened to consume them all. It was in this atmosphere of encroaching doom, within the cold, silent sanctum of his flagship, that High Farseer Eldrion unveiled the final, desperate phase of his prophecy. He summoned Iriel and Iliana not to a council of war, but to a final testament. The dome of crystal sorrows was dark, the usual inner light replaced by a single, terrifying image projected in its center, a swirling orb of soul energy, the nascent, unformed heart of a god. Around it, Eldrian had woven the threads of fate, showing them the future he had foreseen, the only future he now believed was possible. The Trifane assault has failed in its primary purpose, his thought voice stated, devoid of apology or regret. It was a simple statement of fact. It has bled the enemy, yes. It has sown chaos. But it has not brought us to the threshold of victory. It has merely brought us to the brink of our own annihilation. Vex's counterstroke was unforeseen in its precise nature, but the outcome is the same. Our path is blocked. Our strength is spent. Then this was all for nothing. Iliana's voice was a low growl of fury. The shrines we have emptied, the warriors we have lost, all for a failed gambit. Not failed, Eldrion corrected, his calm unshaken, merely incomplete. The prophecy never spoke of a conventional victory. It spoke of a sacrifice. We have been trying to conquer a city when we should have been building an altar. The terrible orb of light in the center of the room pulsed, and the image changed. It showed the fleets of the conquered, their strength not renewed but focused. It showed them pulling back from the grinding wars in the satellite realms, abandoning the territory won with so much blood. It showed them coalescing, forming a single spear-tip formation. A formation aimed not at a gate or a spire, but at the inviolable core of High Comora itself, a place shielded by reality-warping energies that no fleet had ever breached. "We cannot break through the final gate," Uriel stated, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who had seen too much death. "Our weapons are useless against it. Our psychers cannot unmake it." "Your weapons cannot," Eldrion's thoughts replied. "But a soul can, a billion souls focused into a single divine purpose." The image shifted again, and now it showed the source of this power. It was the craft world, Anenvile. It was no longer a ship, but a weapon. The great domes and spires of the world ship began to glow, to resonate, channeling an impossible amount of psychic energy towards its forward spire. "The spear of Anenvale." Eldrion's voice was now imbued with a chilling, ecstatic reverence. "My craft world was not built to sustain life. It was built for this exact moment. For centuries we have prepared. Our infinity circuit is not a repository of memory. It is a psychic capacitor. Every soul stone aboard, every spirit of my people gathered since the fall has been attuned to a single purpose, to become the focusing lens for the final rite." The horror of his plan finally dawned on the other two commanders. He was not just speaking of a weapon, he was speaking of a sacrifice on a scale they had never imagined. "You mean to kill your own craft world?" Uriel whispered, aghast. "A soul for a soul stone. A craft world for a god," Eldrion replied, the fanaticism in his thoughts now absolute. "Every spirit on Anenvale, from the lowest artisan to the highest seer, including my own, will be willingly consumed. Their combined energy, the full psychic potential of an entire craft world, will be channeled through the ship's core and fired as a beam of pure soul energy. It will not destroy the final gate. It will unwrite its existence. It will punch a hole in reality itself, a temporary passage directly into Vekt's throne room." This was the desperate gambit, a suicide mission on a scale that defied sanity. To sacrifice an entire craft world, its entire population living and dead, just to open a door. It was a plan born of utter, absolute desperation. "While the spear is fired," Eldrion continued, his projected plan unfolding with chilling clarity, "the combined remnants of your fleets will execute a final suicidal charge. You will not fight the Drukhari fleet. You will fly through it. You will ignore your losses. You will accept your fate, and you will follow the path my people's sacrifice carves for you. A handful of ships, perhaps only one, will make it through the new portal before it collapses. On board must be the finest warriors we have left. A killing stroke to cut the head from the serpent at the very moment the great sacrifice is made." Ileana Swiftblade stared at the plan, her warrior's mind calculating the impossible odds. But a fierce, terrible light began to burn in her eyes. It was madness. It was suicide. It was glorious. "A final perfect strike," she breathed. "One blow to end it all. The Swordwind will lead the charge." Uriel was horrified. "We are talking about the willing extinction of an entire craft world, the sacrifice of thousands of our best remaining warriors on a gamble." He looked at Eldrion's mirrored, impassive face. "There is no honor in this. This is an atrocity. Honor is a luxury for those who have a future." Eldrion's thought voice cut back, sharp as glass. We have only this, a chance forged from the ashes of my people to achieve the purpose for which we have bled and died. It is this, Prince of Eandon, or it is the slow, inexorable victory of Vex poison and the final triumph of she who thirsts. There is no other path. The decision was made. There was no other choice left on the board. The command was given. Across the war-torn sub-realms, the forces of Eandon and Bieltan began a fighting withdrawal. They abandoned the plazas of Sekmegra and the spires of Shaddam, ceding the blood-soaked ground back to the incredulous Drukhari. The Inari, confused by this sudden retreat, harried their flanks, but could not stop the consolidation. The tattered fleets of the Dawnlight Concord regrouped, forming a single, massive arrowhead in the void before the impenetrable heart of Kamarag. At the tip of this arrowhead was Anaean Vael. The craft world began to glow, a soft, ethereal light that grew in intensity with every passing moment. A low, psychic hum filled the void, a song of a billion souls preparing for their final moment. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, a star of hope being born from an act of mass suicide. The spear of Anaean Vael was being aimed. The final desperate gamble was about to begin, a single throw of the dice for the soul of their race, paid for with the soul of a world. The void before High Kamaruk boiled with the promise of apocalypse. The full might of the Drukhari home fleet, a plague of barbed warships and corsair fleets beyond counting, formed a wall of impenetrable hate between the Dawnlight Conquered and their target. They were a fleet of predators, tasting the final desperate charge of their prey, their comms channels a symphony of jeering laughter and ecstatic bloodlust. At the heart of this maelstrom, the craft world Anaean Vael shone with the light of a newborn sun, its psychic energy reaching a critical, unbearable peak. The song of its billion souls was no longer a hum. It was a choir, a final, defiant lament that resonated in the very soul of every Aeldari, friend or foe. Aboard the bridge of the final tier, Prince Iriel watched the enemy fleet assemble. His face was a grim sculpture of resolve. He had committed his last living warriors, the elite ghost warriors who crewed his flagship, to this final charge. Autarch Ileana Swiftblade stood beside him, a guest on his bridge for this final act. She had condensed the last veterans of her aspect shrines, the survivors of 100 hopeless battles, aboard a single Bieltan strike cruiser, the Thorn of Isha, which flew at their wing. They were the tip of the spear that would follow the path forged by Anaean Vael's sacrifice. It is time. High Farseer Eldrian's final thought voice echoed, not in their minds, but across the entire void. It was a voice of utter serenity, of a being that had already passed beyond the confines of life and death. Remember us? Then it happened. The light of Anaean Vael collapsed inward, coalescing into a single needle-thin point at the prow of the craft world. For a heartbeat there was an absolute silence, a total void of light and sound. Then the spear was unleashed. A beam of pure, white-hot soul energy, the combined psychic might of an entire craft world's history, erupted across the void. It was not a laser or a lance, it was a river of ghosts, a torrent of pure spirit. It did not detonate against the Drukhari fleet. It passed through it, and the ships it touched were unmade. Their crews did not die screaming, they simply ceased to exist, their withered souls annihilated by the sheer, holy purity of the beam. The spear struck the inviolable heart of Kamarach, the shimmering, reality-warping veil that protected Vect's personal domain. There was no explosion. The veil did not shatter. It dissolved. The soul beam did not break the lock. It erased the concept of the lock from existence. For a few precious seconds, a perfect circular tunnel of calm reality was punched through the chaos, a shimmering portal leading directly into the throne spire of the Supreme Overlord himself. And then the light of Aenean Veil went out. The craft world became a dark, silent hulk, its song finished, its billion souls expended in a single, ultimate act, a ghost ship for a race of ghosts. Now, Uriel roared, his voice cracking with the strain, for Ayandin, for the fallen. The final tear and the thorn of Ausha surged forward, their engines screaming as they pushed into the red. They flew down the corridor of calm carved by the spear, the chaos of the Drukhari fleet raging on either side of them like a storm-tossed sea. A dozen other ships from the Concord followed, a desperate, suicidal charge. Most were immediately swatted from the sky, caught by the edges of the collapsing tunnel, or picked off by panicked Drukhari fire. But the two lead ships, shielded by Uriel's tactical genius and Ileana's sheer aggressive will, broke through. They burst through the portal moments before it snapped shut, the reality of Kamora reasserting itself with a psychic thunderclap that crippled the pursuing ships. They had made it. They crashed rather than landed onto the obsidian pinnacle of Vec's personal spire, their ships tearing great furrows in the plazas of pain and monuments to atrocity. The survivors emerged from the wreckage, not an army, but a handful of legends making their last stand. From the final tier came Prince Uriel, the eye of wrath in his hand pulsing with a baleful light. He was flanked by the last of his Wraith Guard, their ghostly forms radiating a cold, implacable fury. From the thorn of Isha came Autarch Ileana, her sunshirred blade gleaming, followed by a mixed phalanx of the last Bieltan exarchs, fire dragons, dire avengers, even a single grim striking scorpion. They numbered less than 50 warriors in total, the last hope of the Asuryani. Before them, seated on his throne of stolen cries, was Asdrubael Vect. He was not alone. The vast chamber was a sea of black and horned helmets, an entire legion of incubi. The personal guard of the tyrant stood in perfect, silent ranks, their claves held at the ready. At Vec's side stood the infamous Drajar, the master of blades, a silent figure of death, whose very presence chilled the air. Vect applauded slowly, the sound of his gloved hands clapping together in obscene mockery in the cavernous hall. "Magnificent," he purred, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Truly, the grandest gesture. You sacrificed a world to knock on my door. I am flattered. And now you have come, and a collection of broken heroes and tragic ghosts to what? Kill me. Do you have any idea how many have tried? This is not an assassination, tyrant." Uriel's voice boomed, amplified by his helm. "This is an execution." "Your words are as hollow as your dying craft world, Prince of Ghosts," Ileana snarled, her patience for theatrics utterly exhausted. She pointed her glowing blade at Vect. "Today, Kamarach falls." There was no more talk. The battle for the soul of the Aeldari race began. Uriel and Ileana charged forward, a twin-headed comet of vengeance. The sea of incubi surged to meet them. The clash was a symphony of violence. The Wraith Guard, silent and unstoppable, fired their Wraith cannons, their distortion blasts erasing swaths of the Incubus Guard, but for every one that fell, 3 more took its place. The BL-10 Exarchs fought with the fury of a dying star. The Fire Dragon Exarch became a human inferno, melting incubi in their baroque armor before he was finally brought down by a dozen blades. The dire Avenger Exarchs formed a tiny, unbreachable shield wall, their shuriken fire a continuous, deadly storm, holding their ground to the last warrior. Ileana was a whirlwind of white and green. She moved through the incubi like a force of nature, her sun-shard blade a blur, her every movement a killing blow. She fought with a mixture of sublime grace and utter unrestrained fury, but even she was being worn down, the sheer number of elite opponents forcing her onto the defensive. Uriel fought with the grim determination of a king defending his fallen kingdom. The Eye of Wrath was a vortex of dark energy in his hand, its cursed power flowing through him. Every swing of his spear unleashed a wave of black fire that turned incubi to ash. He was a demigod of destruction, but he was surrounded, his Wraithguard bodyguard being systematically dismantled by the sheer weight of numbers. It was then that Drajar moved. He did not charge. He simply appeared before Ileana, his twin demicleaves a blur. The duel that followed was a contest of gods. It was the perfected aggression of the sword wind against the cold, murderous perfection of the Incubus Creed. Blades flashed faster than the eye could see, ringing against each other with sounds that tore at the senses. For all her passion and fury, Ileana had met her equal. A feint, a parry, a lightning-fast counterattack, and Drajar's blade slipped past her guard, burying itself deep in her side. She gasped, staggering back, her sun-shard blade falling from her grasp. Uriel saw her fall. A roar of pure rage erupted from him, a sound of grief and fury that momentarily stunned the entire chamber. He abandoned his own fight, blasting a path through the incubi with a wave of dark power from his spear. He charged towards Ileana's fallen form, intending to shield her, and in that moment, he made a fatal error. He turned his back on Asdrubal Vecht. The tyrant of Comorach slid from his throne, a scepter of obsidian in his hand. He moved with a speed that belied his languid posture. As Uriel rushed past, Vecht stepped into his path and struck. The tip of the scepter touched the back of Uriel's armor just below the neck. It was not a blow of strength, but of insidious technology. A wave of agonizing paralytic energy coursed through the prince's body. He collapsed, his limbs locked, his body convulsing, the Eye of Wrath falling from his grasp and skittering across the obsidian floor. He lay there, helpless, watching as Drajar stood over Ileana's bleeding form, and the remaining incubi closed in on his last few embattled Wraithguard. Vecht strolled casually over to him, picking up the cursed spear. He examined it with the detached curiosity of a connoisseur. "It is a pity," Vecht said, his face close to Uriel's paralyzed own. "You had such spirit, such passion, but passion is a flaw, Prince Uriel. It makes you predictable." He raised the spear of twilight. "The god you hope to birth is a stillborn dream. Your people are dead. Your fleets are broken. Your heroes lie dying at my feet. It is all over." The final battle had been fought. The desperate gambit had failed, At the pinnacle of pain, the last champions of the Assyriani had fallen, not to a tide of overwhelming force, but to the cold, calculating cruelty of a single ancient monster. As Vecht raised the Spear of Twilight to deliver the final mocking blow to the fallen Prince Uriel, a change occurred. It was not a thunderous arrival of reinforcements or a sudden reversal of fortune. It was a silence, a profound, soul-deep silence that fell over the entirety of Camorra. The jeering laughter on the Drukhari comms channels died. The screams of the tortured in the flesh pits faded. The very hum of the dark city's malevolent power ceased. Every Aeldari in the twisted sub-realm, from the lowest slave to Asdrubal Vecht himself, felt it. A sudden, horrifying emptiness. A void where something essential should have been. This was the moment of Eldrian's true success. The spear of Annie and Vale had done more than just punch a hole in reality. Its purpose was twofold. The physical gate was for the warriors. The psychic echo, the resonant shockwave of 1 billion sacrificed souls, was the true weapon, and it had taken this long to travel through the mangled skeins of fate to its target. The chime of soulless bells had finally tolled. The ritual was not a gentle awakening, it was a scouring. Across Camorra, every Drukhari felt a cold wind blow through their very being. It was the psychic detonation Yvraine had feared, a wave of pure death energy. But it was also life energy, the combined will and spirit of Anne and Vale. It was a paradoxical force that sought souls, and it found them in the trillions. For a fleeting second, every Cabalite, witch, and homunculus felt their shriveled, withered souls ripped from their bodies. They did not die in a physical sense. Their bodies remained, but they were suddenly, utterly empty. The vital spark that had driven their cruelty, their ambition, their very consciousness, was simply gone. They became statues of flesh, their eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending terror. The energy of these trillions of stolen souls did not dissipate. It flooded into the fabric of the webway, a torrent of raw psychic potential seeking a vessel. It was the final agonizing component of Eldrian's prophecy. The vessel of Inyad, built from the spirits of the craft world dead, was meant to receive this offering and achieve its final glorious apotheosis. But Yvraine had been right. The sacrifice was tainted. It was a foundation built on murder, not willing passage. The energy was an uncontrolled, chaotic deluge, not a gentle river. The birth of Ennead was not the serene, powerful arrival of a savior. It was a cataclysm, a psychic apocalypse. In the void outside, the nascent energy of the new god detonated. It was a silent explosion of impossible power, a shockwave of life and death mingled into one horrifying force. The fabric of the webway, the very dimension in which Camorra existed, tore. Great gaping wounds opened into the raw chaos of the warp. The carefully maintained dimensional stability of the dark city shattered. The satellite realms of Sekmigra and Zalathon were ripped from their orbits, thrown into the swirling vortex of the newly formed wound in reality. Spire districts were torn apart, the impossible architecture of the city groaning and collapsing as the laws of physics that governed it were rewritten in an instant. Back in Vecht's throne room, the effect was just as devastating. The stolen souls of the Incubi Guard were ripped from their bodies, and they collapsed into lifeless heaps of armor. Drajar, a being of pure enigmatic murder, simply vanished, as if he had been an illusion all along. Even as Drubael Vecht cried out, a thin, reedy sound of genuine pain, as a fraction of his own ancient, powerful soul was torn away by the psychic vortex. He staggered, dropping the spear of twilight, his face contorted in agony. The paralytic field-holding Prince Uriel failed. He gasped, his limbs flooding with renewed strength. He surged to his feet, grabbing his fallen spear. He saw Ileana, somehow still alive, clutching the wound in her side as she struggled to rise, her eyes wide with horrified awe at the silent devastation. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The Drukhari were sacrificed. The price had been paid. But this was no victory. The chamber around them was beginning to break apart, the obsidian floor cracking, revealing glimpses of the swirling, multicolored madness of the warp beyond. The air was filled with a sound that was not a sound, a psychic frequency of a divine birth gone horribly, apocalyptically wrong. This was not the birth of a god. It was the birth of a cosmic disaster, a stillborn god. Its birth cry was not a song of hope, but the shattering of a dimension. What is this?" Ileana stammered, her zealotry finally broken by the sheer, terrible reality of what they had unleashed. "Damnation," Uriel breathed, his heart cold with a despair deeper than any he had ever known. Eldrian was both right and wrong. He has given us our victory. He looked around at the silent, empty shells of their enemies and the collapsing reality of their city. And it has cost us everything. Vecht, clutching his chest, threw back his head and began to laugh. It was not a sound of triumph, but the hysterical, broken laughter of a madman who has just seen the punchline to a cosmic joke. "You fools," he shrieked, his voice raw with pain and manic glee. "You sought to burn my kingdom down, and you have instead ripped open the gates of hell upon us all. You haven't killed us. You've just made the game infinitely more interesting." With that, he touched a rune on his gauntlet and vanished in a flicker of dark light, teleporting away to some hidden sanctuary deep within the collapsing core of his city. He left Uriel and Ileana alone in the heart of the apocalypse they had created. The ritual had succeeded, the enemy was defeated, the objective was achieved. And in doing so, they had triggered a dimensional catastrophe that would surely consume them, their fleets, and perhaps the very fabric of the webway itself. It was the ultimate Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so absolute in its devastation that it was indistinguishable from the most profound and utter defeat. The shattering of Kamarach was not a singular event, but a cascade of unending catastrophes. The psychic detonation of the stillborn god did not fade. It became a permanent roiling storm at the heart of the webway, a nexus of raw creation and annihilation energy. The Dark City, a construct held together by psychic will and esoteric science, broke apart under the strain. Imagine a continent of glass struck by a hammer, its shards scattered not in 3 dimensions, but in an infinite number. Vast districts, some the size of worlds, were torn from their moorings. Some were hurled into the raw chaos of the warp, their inhabitants subjected to an eternity of demonic predation. Others were flung into uncharted reaches of the webway, becoming new, isolated kingdoms of despair. The great arterial tunnels that connected the cities shriveled and collapsed, cutting off retreat and reinforcement. The carefully maintained labyrinth became a death trap of dead ends and random portals into hell. Caught in this dimensional collapse was the entirety of the Dawnlight Concord's surviving fleet. The ships that had followed Iriel and Ileana in their final charge were the first to die. They were caught in the psychic backlash of the closing portal, their wraith-bone hulls flash calcified, their infinity circuits overloaded and rendered inert. They became instant ghost ships, adrift in the maelstrom, their crews and spirits silenced in a single, merciful moment. The main fleets, holding their position in the void outside, were hit by the shockwave seconds later. It was not a wave of force, but a wave of pure unreality. On the bridges of Biel-Tan and Eondan ships, seers shrieked and collapsed, their minds irrevocably shattered as the skeins of fate they tried to read dissolved into pure, incomprehensible chaos. The very structure of their vessels rebelled. Wraithbone corridors twisted into impossible shapes. Gravity plating failed, sending crews tumbling into bulkheads that were no longer there. Geller fields designed to shield from the warp flickered and died as the distinction between the webway and the immaterium ceased to have meaning in this blighted sector. From the newly formed rifts in the fabric of space, the denizens of the warp began to pour through. Sentient horrors giggled and capered across the hulls of cruisers, their magical fire turning elegant solar sails into sheets of screaming crystal. Slanishi demonettes danced through the breached corridors of Aeondan ghost ships, their hypnotic songs an exquisite torture to the trapped spirits within the walls. The war against the Drukhari was over. A new, far more horrific war for simple survival had just begun. Aboard the crashed wrecks atop Vek's crumbling spire, Iriel and Ileana faced their own escape. The spire itself was breaking apart, huge chunks of the obsidian structure shearing off and falling into the swirling vortex below. "We have to get back to the ship," Iriel yelled over the beam. Cacophony of a dimension tearing itself apart, he dragged the wounded autarch to her feet. The Thorn's engines might still have power. Their retreat from the pinnacle was a desperate scramble through a world gone mad. The city was now a shifting, insane landscape. Streets ended in sheer cliffs that overlooked roiling seas of pure chaos. Buildings folded in on themselves like paper. The soulless bodies of the Drukhari were everywhere, their empty eyes staring out at the end of their world. But they were not all lifeless. Some began to twitch and stir, their vacant bodies becoming willing vessels for the demonic entities flooding into the realm. A Kabbalite warrior would suddenly jerk upright, its head twisting at an impossible angle, and a multi-tongued shriek of a demon would issue from its lips as it charged them, its splinter rifle firing bolts of pure warp flame. They fought their way back to the wreck of the Thorn of Isha, a small pocket of defiant reality in the madness. A handful of surviving Biel-Tan warriors had formed a defensive perimeter, their shuriken fire holding back the first wave of possessed Drukhari. The ship's bone singers were chanting frantically, their psychic song a desperate attempt to hold the wraithbone hull together as the very ground beneath it dissolved. "Power!" Ileana roared as she stumbled onto the bridge, clutching her side. "Can we get airborne?" The chief bone singer, his face a mask of straining effort, replied without looking up from the humming core. "The engine's live, autarch, but the navigation runes are screaming. The webway is no longer a labyrinth. It is a blender. There is no path out of here. only random chance. That was the state of the shattered front. The grand strategy of the Trifane assault, the desperate gambit of the spear of Aenean Vale, it had all dissolved into 1,000 isolated, hopeless struggles for survival in the poisoned wreckage of Sekmaigra. Eondan survivors, cut off from their fleet, fortified the slave pits, and fought back to back, their silent wraith guards standing as breakwaters against a tide of demons wearing the flesh of their former foes. In the burning forges of Zelathon, the task forces of Aenean Vale, their purpose fulfilled and their farseer dead, fought with a cold, terrifying nihilism, their only goal to take as many of the warp spawn with them into oblivion. And the Inari, who had tried to stop this, were now trapped within it. Yvrain's fleet was beset on all sides, fighting a desperate battle to carve a path of retreat through the collapsing tunnels. She could feel the agony of the stillborn god, a constant psychic scream that threatened to overwhelm her own connection to Iniad. Her quest to unite the Aeldari had led her people into the epicenter of their race's greatest self-inflicted wound. The shattered front was not a line of battle. It was a state of being. It was the moment a grand, epic war devolved into a chaotic, mindless scramble for existence. The armies were broken, the commanders scattered, the chain of command annihilated. All that remained were pockets of survivors adrift in a newly formed hell of their own making, their only objective no longer victory, but to survive the next few moments in the wreckage of their ambition. The war was lost, not to the enemy, but to the very nature of the weapon they had chosen to unleash. In the antechamber of the universe, where the raw, swirling chaos of the immaterium laps against the fragile shores of reality, a being of infinite perception stirred. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, she who thirsts, the eternal bane of the Aeldari, had always been aware of the psychic echoes of its prey, their dwindling numbers, their carefully husbanded souls, their quiet grief. It was all a distant, tantalizing aroma, a promise of a final, exquisite meal deferred. The great enemy was patient. It had an eternity to wait for the last of the Aeldari to fall into its embrace. But the detonation of the stillborn god was not a whisper. It was a scream, a psychic thunderclap of such magnitude that it shook the very foundations of the Prince of Pleasure's domain. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000,000 Aeldari souls being extinguished in a single moment, their life force not gently fading but being violently ripped away. And then it was the sound of a rival god being born and dying in the same terrible instant. To Slaanesh, this was not a tragedy or a cataclysm. It was a symphony. The Dark Prince turned its full, undivided, and rapturous attention towards the source of this incredible stimulus. What it perceived was a thing of sublime, perfect beauty. A wound, a gaping, suppurating, glorious wound in the fabric of reality, leading directly into the heart of the webway, the one place that had always been a sanctuary from its direct influence. The Aeldari, in their desperate attempt to escape their fate, had not just failed. They had carved a grand gilded doorway and invited their doom inside. They had rung a dinner bell for their own devourer. The gaze of she who thirsts was a palpable force. Where it fell, the nascent, chaotic energy of the shattered Komorrah subrealm began to coalesce and corrupt. The random swirls of warp energy, the raw stuff of creation and destruction left by the stillborn god, began to take on a specific, horrifying character. Colors shifted to iridescent pinks and decadent purples. The chaotic screaming of demons began to harmonize into seductive, maddening choirs. The very air grew thick with the scent of cloying perfume and exquisite agony. The shattered heart of the dark city was no longer just a wound in reality. It was becoming a new appendage of the palace of Slaanesh, a permanent tendril of the realm of chaos extending deep into the Aeldari's most sacred domain. This new permanent warp rift was named the Maw of Extravagance by the demonic cartographers of the Great Game. It became a site of pilgrimage for the servants of the Dark Prince. Legions of demonettes, hordes of fiends, and great lumbering keepers of secrets poured through the maw, not as a rampaging army, but as enraptured explorers discovering a new continent of sensation. They found a realm already steeped in pain and excess, a perfect new playground. They infested the ruins of Kamara, turning the abandoned torture pits and pleasure palaces into their own twisted shrines. The soulless bodies of the Drukhari became their first playthings. The demons poured themselves into the empty flesh, creating a new and horrifying army. The lithe grace of a witch was now animated by a demonette, its movements becoming an impossibly fluid dance of death. The hulking form of a grotesque, once a creation of vile science, now served as a mount for a herald of Slaanesh, its flesh-weeping narcotic poisons. This was the birth of the Echo Legions, a force that combined the innate cruelty and skill of the Drukhari with the supernatural horror and resilience of demons. The whispers of a new war began almost immediately. The surviving Drukhari, those who had been in outlying realms or in real space during the cataclysm, were horrified. As Drubal-Vecht, from whatever hidden bastion he now ruled, saw his city not just broken but occupied by the one power in the universe he truly feared. The endless civil wars of the Cabals were replaced by a singular desperate purpose to reclaim their home from the ultimate corruption. The pirates and slavers of Comorak were forced to become something they had not been in 10,000 years, defenders. They began to wage a bitter, hopeless guerrilla war against the demonic tide. Their city now a shared hell where they were no longer the masters. For the Asuryani, the implications were even more dire. The Maw of Extravagance was a strategic nightmare beyond their comprehension. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of the webway. From this new, stable beachhead, Slaaneshi forces could launch raids into any part of the labyrinthine dimension. No craft world was safe, no maiden world was secure. The webway was no longer a network of safe passages. It was now a hunting ground for their eternal nemesis. The news spread like a plague through the fractured remnants of the Aeldari race. Seers on Althaway screamed as their visions of the future were consumed by a tidal wave of pastel-hued damnation. The wild riders of Saimhan, who had valued their freedom above all, found that the paths they rode were now stalked by demonic predators. Even the Harlequins, the secret keepers of the webway, found their hidden paths and secret libraries threatened by the spreading corruption. The Dawnlight Conquered had begun their crusade with a single apocalyptic goal: to awaken a god and save their race. They had succeeded only in creating a new, permanent gateway for their damnation. The war of annihilation against Camorra was over, a catastrophic failure disguised as a Pyrrhic victory. But from its ashes, a new and far more terrible conflict was stirring. This would not be a war of Aeldari against Aeldari. It would be the final desperate war of the Aeldari race against its own self-inflicted doom. The whispers were of the Reign Dethedian, the final dance of doom, a war not for empire or survival, but for the last flickering embers of their racial soul before the all-consuming darkness they had personally invited in. The war was over, but the dying was not. In the wake of the cataclysm, the phase of grand strategy and pitched battles gave way to a brutal, protracted period of flight and consolidation. For the survivors of the Dawnlight conquered, it was not a scouring of the enemy, but a desperate flight from damnation, a chaotic exodus from a hell of their own making. The primary objective for every Asuryani commander was no longer victory, but escape. Prince Iriel, aboard the battered and barely functional Thorn of Isha, with the last survivors of his own command and the remnants of Biel-Tan, became the architect of this desperate retreat. He was no longer a prince leading a crusade. He was a shepherd trying to guide a flock of terrified, broken sheep through a landscape of nightmares. The webway around the maw of extravagance was a treacherous labyrinth of collapsing tunnels, random warp rifts, and hunting grounds for the new Echo Legions. Navigation was impossible. They flew blind, guided only by the frantic, often contradictory visions of their last few half-mad seers. Their journey was a running battle against 1,000 horrors. One moment, they would be navigating a seemingly stable tunnel. The next, the walls would dissolve into shrieking faces and demonic claws would tear at their hull. They fought battles against Slaaneshi demon packs in the cold void, and against possessed Drukhari and boarding actions within their own ravaged corridors. Every soul lost was an irreplaceable tragedy. Uriel was forced to make a series of agonizing decisions. He sealed off entire sections of the ship that had been overrun, sacrificing the handful of warriors trapped there to save the majority. He ordered his dwindling ammunition to be used not on the largest threats, but on the fastest, trying to clear a path rather than win a fight. His command was a long, continuous triage of souls. Autarch Ileana Swiftblade, recovering from her grievous wound, became the heart of their defense. Her zealotry had been burned away by the horror of the stillborn god, replaced by a cold, pragmatic fury. She led the boarding parties, her sun-shirred blade a beacon of defiance in the dark. She organized the defenses, her tactical genius ensuring that their dwindling numbers were always in the right place to counter the next inevitable attack. She and Uriel, once leaders of rival ideologies, were now forged into a seamless unit by shared trauma and the singular goal of survival. They were the ghost of Eandon and the broken sword of Biel-Tan, and together they would save what little remained. Their flight was not a solitary one. Through scattered, desperate psychic messages, Uriel began to rally the other lost fragments of the conquered fleet. He became a lighthouse in the storm, his calm, authoritative presence a point of stability in the chaos. He guided a squadron of Eandon frigates lost and presumed destroyed out of a pocket dimension filled with chronological paradoxes. He coordinated with a handful of Biel-Tan strike cruisers to execute a feint that drew a massive demonic pursuit away from the main evacuation route. It was a fleet action in reverse and a masterpiece of coordinated retreat. Meanwhile, the Aeldari conducted their own desperate consolidation. Yvraine, her heart heavy with the weight of the catastrophe she had foreseen but failed to prevent, focused her power not on fighting, but on shielding. She and her conclave of psychers wove a psychic veil around her fleet, a shroud of Ennead's silent power that made them appear as ghosts to the demonic swarms. They moved through the shattered labyrinth like whispers, their goal not to escape for their own sakes, but to rescue who they could. They found pockets of Azuriani survivors, guardsmen from a forgotten outpost, pilots who had crashed on isolated asteroids of Wraithbone, and brought them into the fold. Yvraine's mission to unite the Aeldari was now a grim parody of its former self. She was no longer a prophet gathering followers, but a rescuer pulling survivors from a shipwreck. The greatest, most horrific task fell to the remaining spirit seers of Ayandan. They had to perform the final, terrible consolidation of their own dead. Vex psychic plague, the ghost contagion, was still rampant within their corrupted infinity circuits. With the maw of extravagance now flooding the webway with Slanishi influence, the maddened spirits of their ancestors were more vulnerable than ever to complete demonic possession. The spirit seers enacted the rite of severance. It was a psychic scouring of their own history. They entered the corrupted circuits of their ships, and with immense sorrow sought out the spirits that were too far gone, whose rage and grief had been twisted into pure malice. They could not heal them. They could only delete them. They performed a final mercy, a psychic euthanasia that unmade the souls of their own heroes, their own kin, to prevent them from becoming puppets of the great enemy. Each severance was a wound in the soul of their craft world, a memory erased, a verse of their great epic poem torn out and burned. They were saving their people by systematically destroying their own past. This was the long, brutal process of the scouring. It was not about cleansing the enemy, but about cleansing their own ranks of weakness, despair, and corruption, all while fleeing a foe that was now everywhere. Weeks turned into months. The flight from the maw of extravagance was a new legend of horror whispered among the Aeldari, a cautionary tale of hubris and damnation. By the time the broken, ravaged remnants of the Dawnlight Concord and the Inari rescue fleets finally broke through into relatively stable passages of the webway, they were barely recognizable. Their numbers were less than a tenth of what they had been. Their ships were patchworks of scar tissue in hasty repair. Their crews were gaunt, haunted veterans of a war that had no glory, only loss. They had escaped the fire, but they would forever carry the stench of its smoke in their souls. The cannons fell silent, but the echoes of their folly would resonate for eternity. The war for Final Dawn, the great crusade of the Dawnlight Conquered, was over. It had not ended in victory or defeat, but in a paradigm shift of galactic consequence, leaving behind a legacy written entirely in ash and sorrow. The Aeldari race, already a flickering candle in the cosmic dark, had been brought to the very edge of final self-inflicted extinction. The craft worlds of Ayandan and Bieltan, once proud titans among their kind, returned to their nomadic paths as hollowed-out shells. Ayandan was now more ghost than reality. The rite of severance, a necessary act of self-mutilation, had saved their infinity circuit from total demonic possession, but at a catastrophic cost. Entire ancestral lines were gone, their memories erased, leaving vast, silent holes in the craft world's history and consciousness. The living population had been decimated to a point where a full recovery was not a matter of centuries, but of millennia, if ever. Prince Iriel, the hero who had led the retreat from damnation, was now a king of a kingdom of dust and echoes, his every waking moment a reminder of the price of Eldrion's false prophecy. He had saved a handful of his people, but he had presided over the death of his world's soul. Bieltan, the Swordwind, was broken. The fiery expansionist dream of a reborn Aeldari empire was dead, drowned in the blood of its finest warriors. Autarch Ileana Swiftblade, the Glimmer Fang, returned not as a conquering hero, but as a grim harbinger of their new reality. The aspect shrines were nearly empty, their exarchs fallen, their traditions maintained by a handful of traumatized veterans. Bieltan society, once a vibrant tapestry of culture and martial pride, was now a monoculture of grim survival. They were no longer a crusade. They were a fortress, their every action now dictated by a defensive, paranoid crouch. Their rage, once a weapon aimed at the galaxy, now turned inward, a bitter poison of recrimination and grief. The craft world Ananvale, the architect of the apocalypse, drifted in the shattered webway as the conflict's most terrible monument, a silent dark hulk. Its billion souls expended, it became a place of cursed pilgrimage. It was a tomb world of unimaginable scale, a testament to the terrible power of faith untempered by wisdom. Eldrion's name was never again spoken aloud by the Assyriani, his memory a curse, a symbol of how the desperate search for salvation could lead to the deepest damnation. Comorra endured. It was not the city it once was, but a fractured, multi-layered hell. The upper spires and core realms were now a permanent dominion of Slaanesh, the echo legions of possessed Drukhari and demons ruling over a court of exquisite agony. But in the lower districts, in the dark, forgotten underbellies, the Drukhari survived. As Drubail Vecht, with his core followers, carved out a new kingdom in the shadows, his genius now turned from ruling a stable empire to waging an eternal clandestine war for his own home. The Drukhari were transformed. Their endless petty rivalries were subsumed by the singular hatred of the demonic invaders. They became more feral, more desperate, and in some ways more dangerous than ever before, a cancer fighting a plague within the same dying body. The Inari under Ivrain emerged from the catastrophe as the only faction with the semblance of a future. They had failed to stop the war, but in its aftermath, their message of unity gained a terrible, undeniable power. They had become the rescuers, the salvagers of their race's soul, refugees from the broken conquered, and even a surprising number of disillusioned Drukhari who had escaped the demonic takeover flocked to their banner. They were no longer a hopeful new creed. They were the sole lifeboat in a drowning sea. But Ivrain's path was now infinitely harder. The birth of Iniad had been horribly botched, its power now a chaotic, unpredictable storm. The maw of extravagance was a permanent wound that bled demons into their home, and her dream of uniting the Aeldari was now a grim necessity for survival, not a glorious prophecy. The balance of power in the galaxy was irrevocably shifted. The Aeldari, as a whole, were removed as a major strategic force. Their internal conflicts had cost them a potency that 1,000 wars with the Imperium or the Orcs never could. The maw of extravagance became a new focus of galactic conflict, a permanent warp storm that drew the attention of not just the Aeldari, but of the Imperium's demon hunters, and even the forces of the other Chaos gods, who looked upon Slaaneş's new prize with envious eyes. The final legacy of the War for Final Dawn was one of cruel, biting irony. In their fanatical quest to awaken a god to save their souls, the Dawnlight Conquered had only succeeded in creating a new, personal hell for their entire species. They had traded a slow, dignified decline for a swift, screaming fall into a deeper abyss. The legends born from this war were not of heroes, but of ghosts and monsters, of false prophets and broken champions. The Aeldari had looked into the face of their doom, and in a final tragic act of despair, had chosen to pull it closer, ensuring that the twilight of their race would be a long, bitter, and entirely self-made age of ash,